All right, call to order this meeting of the Policy Committee for Wednesday, May the 18th, 2022. And we go on to item number 2, which is election of committee chair and vice chair. Of course, our former chair, Director Sinclair, is no longer with us.
So I wanted to put it to the committee. I'll let the committee decide whether you'd like Vice Chair Roden just to step in as chair for the remainder of the term. I believe we have 1 or 2 meetings left, or we're prepared to carry out an election for the chair and vice chair.
Okay.
Yeah, if we just even get a show of hands that you're okay with Director Roden stepping in as chair, that'd be great.
Okay, so show of hands, I guess. Just oh, okay, thank you very much.
Right.
Anonymous. It was completely anonymous, so that's good. We don't know who did what. All right, well, I have no chair's announcements. You will probably be pleased to hear. So we move right on. We have before us the minutes of the March 23rd, 2022 Policy Review Committee. Pardon me? Oh, excuse me. Do we need a vice chair? Sorry.
It's a good question. I mean, sorry. Yeah, in case you're not.
In case I suddenly die or something. Yes.
Yeah, we should elect a vice chair in the event that Chair Roden is absent.
Okay.
So I'll call for nominations for the position of vice chair.
I nominate Linda Brown.
Director Brown, do you accept the nomination?
Oh, that's a ringing endorsement.
Second call for nominations for the position of vice chair. Third and final call for nominations. I declare the nominations closed. Director Brown has been acclaimed as vice chair of the Policy Review Committee. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So again, on to the minutes of March 23rd, 2022 Policy Review Committee meeting. Thank you. Are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, all in favor? That is carried. We move on to item 5.1, policy 9.1.116 board expenses. We have a report and presentation.
We'll just get the presentation set up and then I'll start.
Chair Roden, just as we're waiting, do you mind if I do a quick introduction? Casey Stein, which is sitting right behind me here, he's our new local government intern, and this will be his first committee meeting. So I'm going to formally introduce him to the board tomorrow, but just thought I would introduce him to this committee at this time. So he started on May 9th and is working with me for a few weeks, and then is with us for a full year, working through every department that we have and really learning our business. So just wanted to welcome Casey.
Welcome, Casey. Is this the NDIT intern program?
Yes.
Well, welcome to Kev. Where are you coming to us from?
Kelowna.
Kelowna. Oh.
Yeah, from Kelowna, just so I can catch Ward on there as well.
See, all the best people end up in Kamloops.
Okay, so I'm going to provide a bit of background and some context, and then I'm going to turn it over to Doug for the remainder of the presentation. So we briefly went over this at the last Policy Review Committee meeting. Our proposed plans to have board expenses contained in a policy rather than in a bylaw. So currently our board expenses are addressed in the board remuneration bylaw. We proposed removing those out into a separate expense policy with some additional changes. So that will result in the remuneration bylaw just addressing compensation, and the board expense policy will just address eligible expenses. So just a bit of context for the changes. Expenses are better suited in a policy. The remuneration bylaw is quite busy. There's a lot of information in there. Some of the expense provisions are kind of get lost in it. This was also a BDO recommendation that greater clarity and detail be provided with respect to allowable expenses for both board and for staff. Changing needs and local conditions. We've obviously seen the cost of food, among other things, go up. So we've re-examined our per diem meal amounts. And then this also will create some alignment with a employee expense policy. It's an administrative policy that we're working on. And we just want to ensure that best practices and guiding principles around expenses are incorporated into a policy. And our hope is that there'll be greater ease of reference for directors with having this in a policy, and it'll be easier to update when changes are required. So guidelines. So this review that we've done, updates that we've done have been informed by UBCM's council and board remuneration guide. And these guiding principles that you see up there. So local elected officials should not themselves be expected to pay expenses that are incurred in order to perform their roles. Compensation paid to elected officials for expenses incurred on the job should not, however, be considered or pursued as an additional source of remuneration. So balancing those two principles. So of course, it's legitimate that expenses which are incurred by elected officials on the job and in order to do the job be reimbursed. And in addition, of course, there's an expectation that elected officials, similar to staff, are expected to conduct their activities in such a way as to optimize the value to the taxpayer. Best practices, our updates are also guided by best practices. We've been using that best practices quite a bit lately, but all of our policies, we're hoping will incorporate best practices. The importance of that is public body, as a public body, we're accountable to our residents, and we're of course required and expected to follow a reasonable standard. And we've also looked at comparisons with other local governments, which is a really useful and necessary measure. And a best practice is to actually compare, create comparison groups and look at other similar regional districts in comparison. So just high level overview of the new board expense policy. It incorporates some of the guiding principles I noted, expense provisions that were previously contained in the remuneration bylaw with some minor changes and additional details. Some specific guidelines around transportation expenses, hotel accommodation, and meal per diems, as well as updated meal per diem amounts. And I'm going to turn it over to Doug. He's going to go through each section.
Thank you. I thought the easiest way, I know you've got a copy of the draft policy in front of you with your package, but just walk you through each section and talk about really what it says. So the initial section, once we get past the sort of guiding principles, just talks in general about expenses that directors will be reimbursed for reasonable food, accommodation, and travel expenses. And there's a schedule at the back of the policy that outlines the allowable expenses and the amounts, which we'll just talk about the rates as we go through. So section 2.3 basically says, and this is not a change from what we had before, the most economical mode of transportation is to be used. So in some cases, depending on the distance or length of a trip, it might be more economical to fly to a location versus driving. We've always had the policy to say we'll pay the lesser of the two amounts. So if you end up flying and it's more expensive than applying a per kilometer rate for the number of kilometers, then we would cap it at what we would have paid for driving, or vice versa.
Questions as you go through this rather than at the
We
end?
can. It's up to you.
When we talk about travel, it doesn't really say, I mean, if there's an airport close to you, but there are times when you have to get to an airport and you use the kilometers in between, such as Merritt, because we don't have an airport.
Yeah.
And then it's the flight included. So sometimes one alone is not the cheapest way of.
Yeah, absolutely. And we would normally pay both like the kilometers to the airport, the parking at the airport, and the cost of the flight. If you were attending, say, FCM in Quebec City, clearly it's going to be cheaper to pay that than it would be for you to drive all the way to Quebec and back. But some distances are more on the cusp. And so we're just looking at what we think would be, because sometimes it ends up being the director's choice of which way they would prefer. So we're just looking at what the comparable costs would be to do it one way versus the other and make sure that it's sort of capped at what the
And
more economical.
Can we also define what the flight rate would be? I mean, sometimes you can get a $99 flight, but normally the flight is, I'm wild guessing, $300. And are you looking at a reduced flight? I've had this happen elsewhere. So somebody comes in and says, well, the flight was $350, but they said, well, there was a $99 flight. Why didn't you catch that? Well, they missed it. It became a big issue. that
Yeah.
You need
For
to
us-
put the word, the regular fare or something in there.
I'd say about 99.9% of the time, it's the TNRD staff who are pre-booking the flights on behalf of the directors. When we're usually prepaying the registration costs, pre-booking hotels, pre-booking flights. So it's whatever the cost we were able to obtain on the day when we were doing that.
But the policy doesn't state that. I'm just,
Yeah, and that we could clarify that, sure. There was another question as well.
Driving it, have you changed it for kilometer rate? And will that be flexible?
Just the kilometer rates, I noticed obviously at $2.08 or whatever. But that fluctuates too. It may go back to 140, it may never go back, it may go up. But is there a policy in place that you can adjust that?
Well, for the per kilometer rate, we're suggesting 61 cents, which
Yeah.
matches what CRA publishes each year for what they find to be an acceptable per kilometer rate. That's how historically we've always done it. We just match the CRA rate. Currently in 2021, it was 58 cents per kilometer. They've bumped it up to 61 cents per kilometer for 2022.
So that's stated somewhere in the policy.
It comes
in
a minute.
Okay,
right there.
there you go.
So it's on that schedule of allowable expenses at the
But
back.
so if the CR rate changes, our rate automatically changes too.
Yes. And so I'll come to it in a later slide, but essentially the wording in the policy is to say that the rate will match the published rate by CRA, which is currently 61 cents. So the idea with that is if CRA bumps up the rate, the new rate would kick in automatically for us without having to take the policy back to be amended because it just states it will match the CRA rate. But in general, the idea is we weigh flying versus driving. And if one is, clearly more expensive than the other, regardless of which way the director has chosen to travel, what we reimburse is the lesser of the two.
Director Stamer, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. What about cab expenses, Doug? Not that we use it that much, but is there a limit on cabs?
That comes
Like,
in
I'm
later
using
as
an
well.
I'm using as an example, like if you ended up having to fly somewhere and then you have to cab it to your hotel, that sort of thing. I'm not trying to nitpick here, but what are the parameters around that?
So that comes in later as well. Public transport is listed as an acceptable expense was supported with receipts. So if, for instance, I was in your shoes and traveling to a conference and I took a cab from my house to the airport to fly, I would submit the receipt for the cab ride and be reimbursed for that based on the actual cost. It's hard to put a limit on it because, different distances apply depending on where you live, or if you're arriving at the airport in the city of destination and have to take a cab to the hotel. I mean, different cities, the distances are different. So we've just, and this is not a change. We've just said, submit the receipt and you'll be reimbursed based on the receipt for public transit. That would go for like SkyTrain or taxi or bus, any of those.
Yeah,
Bus,
understood.
yeah.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, thanks very much for that.
Okay.
Director Bass?
Doug, what do you do with the director who may have given up driving a car and just has an electric bike? And they would be required then to rent a car to drive if that was what was chosen. So how would that be handled?
Again, I think it would be based on the lesser of the amounts. So I'm using driving versus flying as an example, but we'd be using the most economical mode of transportation in terms of cost. So if you chose or was in a position of need to rent a car, and let's say it was over 3 days or something, and you had the receipt, and we would compare that to the per kilometer charge for driving a car, and if it was going to be, less than what we would have paid in kilometers, then you would be reimbursed the actual amount for the rental. If it was going to be significantly more, then we might have to have a discussion about it, because it's not so much just, is it more economical, but what was the necessity?
Thank you. The government of Canada is noted, in my experience, to be considerably behind the times in just about everything they get involved in. And it seems to me that this rate of 61 cents a kilometer has been floating around here for quite a number of months. And it certainly doesn't reflect what's happened to the price of gasoline in the last 4 to 6 weeks. So I'm wondering if you have considered at all the possibility of increasing the rate per kilometer beyond that which is recommended by the Canada Revenue Agency, because there's no provision, certainly no provision for retroactive. That's my first question. Second question is facetious, but it is wondering if you're contemplating leasing cars, or if lessor is spelt wrong up there.
Yeah, could be.
And the third question is not facetious, but it is related to accommodation. So maybe if you want to deal first with the question of the 61 cents a kilometer.
Yeah, sure. I can answer that, and then maybe it would be better if we move on, because some of these questions, I do have slides coming up that address some of those topics. In terms of the 61 cents per kilometer, you get into a bit of a mess when you start looking at increasing it. So 61 cents per kilometer, first of all, is what CRA is defined as what they see as reasonable without it creating a taxable benefit. So when we increase it beyond the 61 cents per kilometer, we start getting into the realm of having to calculate a taxable benefit for the director and withholding taxes from the amounts. So it becomes more complex. The other thing is the 61 cents isn't meant purely to apply to the cost of gas, but really it's business use of the vehicle as a whole. So it's meant to cover the gasoline, the insurance, repairs and maintenance on the car, wear and tear, that kind of thing. My car, and I did put some thought into it, and I've looked at what some other local governments are doing. Some of them actually have purposefully kept the rate lower than the CRA rate. I think Capital Regional District in Victoria is using, I think it's 50 cents. So I looked at my vehicle and I said, okay, my vehicle, I'm going up and down hills here in Kamloops all the time. It doesn't get quite the fuel economy that a similar vehicle in the Lower Mainland or a flat area might get. I get about, on the odometer on the dashboard, it's got a reading that says I'm basically averaging about 11 liters of fuel to go 100 kilometers. So if I take 61 cents times 100, that's $61. Divide by 11 liters, I'm somewhere over $5 per liter that I'm getting, compensated for effectively if I'm driving 100 kilometers. But again, there's more in there than just fuel, right? So when I look at it on the whole like that, I recognize the cost of fuel's gone up phenomenally. I still think sticking to the 61 cents is appropriate in this instance.
Well, if the cost of fuel, I realize the fuel is only one component of the 61 cent thing, but the cost of fuel has more than doubled since that 61 cent notion was first bandied about here. So it strikes me as unlikely that I don't know the accounting ramifications, but it seems to me to be unlikely that it would become a taxable benefit. Even if there might even be a possibility of increasing it on a temporary basis, subject to the fluctuation in fuel prices. But No, I know that you're not spending 61 cents. I'm not spending 61 cents a kilometer on gas alone. Of course not. But nothing else has gone down either. That's all.
I would just like to say, ask you a question. Okay, when you're in Vancouver, do you take a taxi or do you take your SkyTrain? Because are you going to differentiate between the two?
Generally, when it comes to the public transportation, you get a receipt and we reimburse you based on the receipt.
So it doesn't
So
matter.
we're not sitting there going, well, you could have taken the SkyTrain instead of a taxi and that would have been cheaper or whatever. Usually those components of the expenses are fairly minor. But I think, it depends on the situation. I've attended conferences where, we knew that we were arriving at the airport and we were going to a hotel and we had already set up prepaid SkyTrain cards for everyone to use. Like usually it's being planned out to the point where those kinds of things are being taken into consideration. But I'm not necessarily going to say if you're in a situation where you're at the hotel and there's some reason for taking a taxi to another location that I'm going to say, well, you could have taken the SkyTrain. That's not going to happen.
Thank you. I see. I don't know if there's other slides coming up. Are we dealing with this, the meals and per diem?
We haven't got there yet.
We haven't got there yet.
I'm walking through the entire policy, so we're still on 2.3 at this point.
Okay.
It's a 20-page document that we've got to go through.
Yeah.
So I think if we could just hold questions till we've gone through all the slides, because some of the questions that people might have right now might be addressed further on. Director Brown, Vice Chair Brown.
I just have one. There are some words in your policy that are absolute, like on 2.3 where pay the lesser cost regardless. There may be circumstances that you may not want to be regardless. The e-bike or I don't know, some other scenario. And I'm just hoping that some of the language can be.
Massaged.
Yes,
Yeah.
good word. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's part of the point of today is to get feedback. I'll move on. So in the terms of accommodations, 2.4 is just basically making the point that the accommodations are based on a standard hotel room, booked at the lowest rate available. And again, most of the time, when it comes to hotels, it's a conference of some kind. Usually it's TNRD staff who are pre-booking the hotels. So if we were to attempt to book a hotel and they said, this is the best rate we can give you that day, I'm not going to say, well, it had to be a cheaper room and therefore we're only going to expense so much. It's going to be the best rate we can get. But the upgrades may not be expensed point is to say that if a director were to show up at the hotel and say, I want a better room, I'd like to upgrade, then that's on them. That's a personal expense if it's going to cost more. It's up to the chair. Okay. So, and that's again, looking at other local government practices and what we're seeing out there as best practice. In terms of meals, they'll be reimbursed in the form of a per diem rate applicable for breakfast, lunch, and dinner only. So no more incidental component to it. The rates are considered the maximum that will be reimbursed with the exceptions of meals that are provided as part of the convention or function, generally paid with the registration costs. So there are examples where there's a banquet as part of a banquet dinner as part of a conference. And usually when you're registering for the conference, the cost of that is set by the conference organizer. There may be an option to pay that cost or not pay the cost at the time of the registration, but that cost is being set by that third party. So we're not limiting that. We're simply saying where you're going and out of pocket for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you're going to claim the per diem amount, and the amount is what you're going to get We're not going to accept receipts for a higher amount and reimburse that. It'll be set by the per diem amount. There's a few slides here on meals. So, sorry, I'm just trying to get back to the right slide there. So the proposed per diem amounts are $25 for breakfast, $30 for lunch, and $45 for dinner. So that's $100 daily max. This is a little different than what I brought in front of the committee of the whole in February. In February, we were proposing, and you recall what we've had up until now are two separate sets of rates. So local or interior BC rates, and then a higher rate when you're in Vancouver, Victoria, Whistler, Lower Mainland area. So we were proposing, based on a review of what other local governments generally are providing, $80 a day for the lower rate and $100 a day for the upper rate, as opposed to the 100 and 120 we currently have. So we've received some feedback and we've done a little bit more research. And the thought here is that at $80 a day, there is actually a chance that directors would lose out, receive less under the new rate structure than they would have under the old rate structure, which is not the goal. The goal was to partially to simplify how this would all work and make it a little bit less confusing and more straightforward. And also, I've never liked the incidental component because it tends to be vague, right? Like, I think historically, there were lots of examples of what might fall into that incidental component. When you're traveling in a hotel, you'd make a phone call to home, check in with the family and let them know everything's fine. And generally the hotel was charging you for each and every time you picked up the phone, things like that. A lot of those things are no longer really a reality. People are carrying cell phones. The hotels generally aren't charging those same kind of charges. There's just a lot less stuff that sort of you could justify that incidental amount. So looking at it, broadly, we looked at it and said, well, between the $80 and $100 rate that we were talking about and the 100 and 120 rate that we've had, we thought the best compromise would be just land on a single rate, $100 a day, no matter where you are. Keeps it simple. So you really only have one set of rates now instead of two. So it simplifies it a little bit. The individual breakfast, lunch, and dinner rates are higher than they were before because we removed the incidental portion. So it's still $100, but instead of $18 for lunch, it's $30. Instead of $16 for breakfast, it's $25. I did run some scenarios looking back at 2019 and pulling some directors' actual claims, both claims they had made for per diems while traveling, and also looking through the Visa card summaries at any meals that might have been purchased on their behalf, and applying the old rate with an incidental component versus the new rate with no incidental component, but higher individual meals. And in most cases, directors did not lose money at a single $100 rate. It was, I think, one incident where due to the fact there were a lot of overnight trips and a lot of incidental amounts claimed, there was a slightly less amount that they would receive. But in the other cases at this structure, directors would not be out of pocket compared to the old rate. And I think it achieves the goal of simplifying it. You just basically, rather than dealing with a daily rate where you're deducting meals that you've been provided and kind of going through this process of trying to figure out exactly what's applicable and what's not, you're really just looking at saying, well, did I pay for breakfast, or did I pay for lunch, or did I pay for dinner? And you're just claiming those individual meals during the period of time that you're traveling. One simple rate for no matter where you're traveling. So following up on that, the per diem rate is not to be claimed for any meals that are provided to you. The The typical example is where you're attending a conference and, as part of the conference, they're providing lunch. The idea is that somewhere along the lines, if it's buried in that registration cost for the conference, they're recovering the cost of that meal. So essentially the T&D is paid for that meal. So if it's been provided to you, you shouldn't be claiming an expense for it. And this part really talks about, what it says is where you're required to travel away from home to attend a formal meeting, convention, seminar, or other scheduled function, and which requires an overnight stay, you're entitled to claim the per diem rate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the meals that you're required to pay for. So it's sort of following up on the last stanza, where basically, in a 24-hour period, in a single 24-hour day, you're claiming lunch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Those are the 3 per diem meals that you'd be able to claim. It also, works for partial days. So if I've got an example here. Let's say you had breakfast at home and you left mid-morning to attend a conference. You purchased lunch and dinner on Sunday on the road. On Monday, first day of the conference, you purchased breakfast, lunch was supplied. Then you were out of pocket again for dinner. The next day you purchased breakfast. Conference wraps up just before noon. You buy lunch on the road on your way home, and you're home in time to have dinner at home. What you'd be claiming would be the meals there that you're out of pocket. You wouldn't claim the lunch on Monday that was supplied to you. You wouldn't claim 3 meals for Sunday because you were only traveling a portion of the day. And likewise on Tuesday, you're home in time to have dinner at home. So you're not claiming an expense for dinner you weren't obtaining on the road. You're not trying to figure out, well, okay, I've got a daily rate and I've got to deduct meals that were provided to me. You're just basically saying, okay, I bought this lunch, I bought this breakfast, I bought this dinner, and making the claims on the form. It's not only is it, I think, easier for directors to understand how to make the claim, it's easier to explain and make it clear and transparent to the public exactly what we're doing. It's not skipping forward. So the other piece that we wanted to address was what if you're not traveling overnight? It's a same day travel. You leave home in the morning and you return home that evening. Let's say you're traveling from Blue River to attend a board meeting. Typically, past practice has been that you're traveling away from your home community. The director would be entitled to claim a per diem for the lunch they have immediately before the board meeting. So that's allowed for in section 2.8 here, basically just saying, look, it's not overnight travel, it's same day travel. You're not necessarily required to travel overnight, but it makes sense and consistent with past practice that you'd be able to claim an expense for that lunch immediately before the board meeting. Now, there's a separate policy around board accommodations where, due to inclement weather or late hour of a meeting or early hour of a meeting, the board members are entitled to stay overnight and they'd be able to claim meetings in that instance too. So it doesn't apply to the same day travel because you're really talking about overnight, but there have been instances where, for example, directors are arriving to attend a committee meeting on Wednesday afternoon. They arrange to stay overnight to attend another committee meeting Thursday morning. That would still be acceptable and you'd still be claiming those per diem meals for the period of time that you're traveling. This is really just specifically to allow for the fact that, where it's a shorter same day meeting, past practice has been, and we would still allow for that lunch immediately prior to the board meeting could be expensed. And in any case, this is a little different than past practice, but it was one of the things, recommended by the BDO report is that, again, for clarity and simplicity and transparency, it would work better for directors to simply pay for their own meals and claim the per diem reimbursement, rather than where we've had situations where maybe the CAO or myself are sitting at the table and we just pick up the bill for the entire table and pay for it that way. We want to keep it more straightforward where the directors pay their own expense, put in their per diem claim, and it keeps the transparency a little bit more straightforward. In terms of all other expenses that wouldn't be applicable for a per diem rate, which is really, there's per diems on the schedule allowable expenses for meals, the 61 cents per kilometer for travel.
Excuse me. It's Director Quinn here. I had a question on the previous slide.
Hello, welcome Director Quinn. We're going to be holding questions till the end because we're finding that some questions people have right now are being addressed in slides which we have yet to see.
Okay, thank you.
So there's those, and then there's also a per diem rate for personal private accommodation. If a director stays with a friend instead of in a hotel, they can claim a private accommodation amount. Those are really the three per diem rates. Everything else should be supported with a detailed receipt. And just for a reminder that detailed receipt should include the details of what's been purchased, from who and when, and the applicable sales taxes, the receipt with all the details, and not simply a visa slip. There's a Schedule B to the policy as well that lists the meetings for which directors are entitled to claim expenses. So again, in the remuneration bylaw, we used to have this all listed out, for this meeting you can claim, for this meeting you can't, and so on. We put it into a table there. This is a similar table, and I haven't reproduced it up here, but basically it's just a list of the meetings. It's the last page of the policy that expenses are applicable to. So it includes, regular board meetings, it includes inaugural meetings, orientation seminars, strategic planning sessions. There's a whole list of things here. The statutory TNRD committees, select and standing committees. There's ones that directors are appointed to, Fraser Basin Council, Kamloops Airport Authority, and so on. And then there's 4 specific conferences listed. The Fcm Conference. Any of the directors attending FCM are entitled to claim expenses for that. The UBCM, LGLA conventions, and SILGA, historically, it's been EA directors only who are able to claim those ones, because typically if a municipal director is attending those conferences, it's the municipality that's paying for them to attend, not the TNRD. So there's no real change on there. We've listed them virtually the same. I think some of the conferences were summarized as all statutory TNRD committees rather than listing the individual committees, but there's really no change there. There's another section, section 3, travel expenses. And maybe we could massage the wording on this a little bit too, because frankly, we've already talked about travel expenses earlier in the policy, but this is the section that we referred to in the past as like EA travel allowance or travel allowance. This is on top of specific, kilometers for attending the specific meetings here. The policy has allowed for electoral area directors, and maybe I'll just read it out for clarity. In addition to travel expenses related to attendance at the defined meetings, electoral area directors are entitled to submit per kilometer expense claims for travel to and from meetings within their respective electoral areas or meetings directly related to the business of the electoral area. And that's to a maximum of $2,000 a year. So that's no change from what we had before. And municipal directors are likewise entitled to a claim. It's a lesser amount, $500 a year. Entitled to submit per kilometer claims for travel to and from meetings directly related to the business of both the respective municipality and the TNRD. I mean, it could be just on behalf of the TNRD, but the idea is we wouldn't be paying for travel only on behalf of municipal business. It tends to be accessed much more rarely, which is part of why the lower threshold is there. The only real change to this was just reinforcing in the wording the requirement to support these claims with sufficient detail. So either a logbook could be utilized, or with the new claim form, you could basically list each individual trip as a line on the form, provide the detail, about where you were meeting, what the subject of the meeting was, enough detail you can kind of understand what the purpose of the meeting was and claim the kilometers that way. In a perfect world, you would download a map from Google that would show the kilometers, and that would support the kilometers you're claiming, but I'm not requiring that. But it is sometimes handy. The next section with communication expenses, again, this is no change from what we had before. Directors can claim reimbursement for communication expenses if they're properly supported with detailed receipts and invoices. It's always been asked for that they be submitted monthly. It's $1,500 a year for electoral area directors and $750 for municipal directors. And those expenses, we've got some examples in the policy, but it could be for services. It could be, internet, mobile phone, home landline phone, any real means of communicating where you can be reached by the public. It could also be hardware. So if you're buying a new cell phone, you can expense the cost of that phone up to the annual maximum. And those maximums are on a fiscal or calendar year. So come January, they get renewed. The main issue I've had with this one in the past is either not enough detail being provided. We've had some directors who had received, for example, an email from their internet company saying, you have a bill of $100 ready for you to pay. And that's what they've submitted as a snapshot of that email. What I need is the actual invoice, the invoice from TELUS or Bell or whoever that says, this is what you're paying for. Here's the GST that was applied. This is the month that it applies to, all of that detail. So just make sure, often there's a little button on the email. So click here to view the invoice. Well, that's what I need, is for you to click there and reproduce that invoice and not just the email. But other than that, there's really no change here. And that's just a sample of an actual invoice. Section 6 deals with alternate directors. In the previous remuneration bylaw, there were certain meetings where alternate directors are entitled to claim expenses but not get paid for their time, or vice versa. So these 3 bullets really capture all of it in terms of the expenses. So alternate directors are entitled to claim expenses for attending regular board meetings or committee of the whole meetings or other committee meetings in the absence of the regular director. And they can also claim expenses for up to 3 meetings per year with the regular director in attendance, because it creates a learning opportunity for them to see how the board's functioning and what's expected at the meeting. With those 3 meetings, they are entitled to claim expenses, but they would not receive remuneration. So that would be addressed in the remuneration bylaw that would be coming forward. But in terms of these meetings, they could claim expenses either way. So the policy just basically says you're entitled to expenses. They may also claim expenses for inaugural board meetings and orientation meetings with the regular director in attendance. And they may claim expenses for board strategic planning meetings and EA director committee meetings in the absence of the regular director only. So that's the specifics that apply to alternate directors. With the schedule of allowable expenses, again, it was difficult to reproduce on a slide. The only real change on that schedule from the schedule on the remuneration bylaw is the change in the meal per diem rates, the 61 cents, and changing the wording to say it will automatically match the CRA rate. And just before I get to questions, I also wanted to pull up the new claim form. So this is tweaked slightly from what I showed the committee of the whole in February, but this is essentially what we propose as the, yeah, I can make it a little bit bigger. So essentially, and the intent is that we can, it's set up as a Excel document. Most everyone has Excel. I mean, we provide the directors with a device to be used at board meetings. So it's going to have the proper version of Excel. It's locked down. So if I try to, delete a cell or something, it's going to say, sorry, you can't. But it's fillable. So you can type in, a name, the area, the mailing address. These cells down here, you can put in the date and it could be a regular board meeting or policy committee meeting. But if it were say an electoral area travel claim for kilometers, you could say, traveling to Vavenby to attend a, enough detail that we can understand the business purpose. We fill in kilometers and it automatically applies the 61 cents. And okay, there's a glitch. It will automatically apply the 61 cents. Yeah. Hotel cost, it's going to automatically sum it up at the back here. Other expenses, and there's some notes down at the bottom to kind of, again, parking, ferries, airfare, those kinds of things. If there's an actual receipt to be attached, could be filled in there. And we've also allowed for those communication expense claims. If you had a phone bill and it was $100, you could fill it in there. What we've set up on this side is to create a separate total for accounts payable versus payroll. The way we have it set up right now, communication expenses are being paid out to directors through the payroll system as a direct deposit along with the annual remuneration you receive. And that's because that's a taxable benefit. So typically what's happened in the past is we receive the claim, we forward it to payroll, they calculate how much taxes need to be withheld. Then it goes forward to accounts payable. We write a check for $100. And then on your next direct deposit of pay, we're withholding the applicable taxes from that $100. And it creates confusion. The directors don't understand why they're not connecting the two. The pay comes in, it's a lesser amount. So the way we've changed it is we get the claim for the $100. It goes to the payroll department. They calculate the net amount, the tax withholdings, and they add it into the amount being paid every other week for the annual remuneration. So it would just be an increase. The net amount would be the increase on top of your remuneration going directly into your bank account. So to keep it straight between what we need to cut a check for and what payroll's handling, is just set up to come into two different totals here. There's also a second page to it wherein you can, this is where you have a worksheet for claiming those meal per diems. So you could fill in here and say, I attended Silga, for instance, what date you left home to departed to attend the conference, and the time of day, and the date and time of the return. So if you left at 7 in the morning, you're writing 7 a.m. here. If you got back at 7 p.m. on the Friday, it was 7 p.m. here. You can, go through it and say, okay, well, as I'm going through it, you can make that bold. You could say, well, on the first day, I had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the second day, breakfast and lunch were provided, and I was only out dinner. You can easily kind of use this as a cheat sheet to add up the number of meals, and then you could come in here and say, okay, well, that adds up to one breakfast. one lunch. Two dinners. And it's going to calculate the amounts. There's the per diem rates. It's going to calculate the appropriate amounts and carry them forward to the first sheet. So it gets included in the total to be paid. So it should keep the calculation piece relatively simple and straightforward for you. And that's basically, you know, the idea is you can use this for multiple meetings. You could hand it in once a month. If necessary, you could hand it in, you know, more frequently if there's some larger expenses you don't want to wait to be reimbursed for. But that's the intent of using this form, and how the rates on the allowable expense sheet would be applied here. There'll be a similar one for hospital district, because there's separate forms for hospital district. So that's really it. We can go back to questions now.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. Now, does everyone have a copy of the agenda in front of them so that you could follow along? Is it going to be easiest to go back to page 1 and work through it piece by piece rather than jumping around like grasshoppers? Okay, we have consensus. So we're going to go back to, on your agenda, it is page 10 of 15, page 1 of 6 of the actual board expense policy. So we will start.
Go back to the slide.
So we will start with guiding principles. Any comments on items 1.1 or 1.2? Give everyone a moment to get back to there. This is an open book test. So Vice Chair Brown.
When we look at 1.1, reimbursements, blah, 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 should not be considered an extra source of remuneration or used to subsidize directors' personal or business activities. Is that actually defined in the community charter in those words?
That wording's taken directly from the UBCM. I don't remember what it's exactly called.
The
It's
board and remuneration guide. It's the guiding principles around expenses.
Can we just reference the UBCM principles rather than stating, because this is kind of negative that we are trying to override the system for our own personal use. And I'm offended by that first line. So I don't know if anyone else is, probably not, but if we just reference the UBCM principles, that would be.
Or, I mean, we can put it into sort of different words or language. I think we have to remember that our policies are public facing. So the public is not going to know what the UBCM principles are. And so the
But they're
intent,
accessible. They're always accessible.
our policies are, but if we just reference the UBCM principles, a member of the public is won't know what those principles are. Or do you mean just like keep that in there and reference?
Or
as per-
massage some of the wording, because
Sure,
it's
yeah.
making it look like you're needing to come down hard on us because we're potentially abusing the system.
Yeah.
And I would like that wording changed somehow to say, we're just abiding by these principles.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, and that's certainly not the intent. We did look at other regional districts' expense policies, and they did have those guidelines, those guiding principles built into sort of the outset of their policy. I think it sort of just sets the tone of what our policy is trying to achieve, but we can certainly massage is the word today,
Yeah.
massage the wording.
Yep. I'd also point out that same wording has been in the remuneration bylaw for several years now. It's not new.
Yeah, it's offended me for a number of years now,
Okay.
so thank you.
Possibly a footnote would be the elegant solution here. After, at the end of 1.1, used to subsidize directors' personal or business activities. Superscript 1, and at the bottom, as per UBCM, and reference the actual section. You don't have to quote the whole thing, just as per UBCM regulation 23.1D or whatever it is. And if people want to then take it further and actually check that, then they can, but does that satisfy you? Thank you. And I saw that Director Gillis and Director Rothenberger, Director Walsh all have, so we'll start with Director Walsh.
And that's a concern from the past.
Can you turn your mic on?
It's just small.
Your talk, Director Brown?
There you go. Yes. Anyways, I don't have a problem with that at all. And in fact, I have a concern that we might be creating a possibility of these reimbursements incurred could be extra source, because if we go to just a per diem, especially with 25 for breakfast, 30 for lunch, 40, I mean, I think that's too high without receipts. Personally, like there should be two levels. It's almost, you know, like if you're not going to provide receipts, then it should be, in my opinion, let's say 50% or whatever, because I can easily, especially if you come to, pardon? Yeah, but that's why I'm just saying that these, okay, I'll leave it at that, but that's related to, I think some of these things and even the communication reimbursement are questionable for people like such as myself to claim internet expenses. But
So I think it belongs where it is. I think I'll leave it alone. That's my statement.
Director Rothberg. And Director
Thanks.
Walsh, if you could turn off here.
Yeah.
I know it takes getting used to.
I've got a bunch of questions, but I'll stick to I'll just go as the points come up. I'm not at all offended. And I actually think we need to be a little bit stronger, because it almost sounds permissive right now, should not be considered. As if, well, you shouldn't really do it, but if you do it, you know, if you want to do it, fine. I think it should be more like must not be considered or not to be considered. That's my only comment on that. I mean, I think I have to be abundantly clear on every point as to what's permissible and not, and what isn't. And then it should state that clearly and leave no doubt.
So would something like expenses incurred fulfilling those duties are not to be considered?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
So replace should with are. Everyone good with that? All right, thank you. Director Gillis.
No, I think probably my question at this point is redundant.
All right, thank you. So 1.1. We're going to change should to are and add a footnote to show where that final sentence comes from. We move on 1.2.
So I was under the impression that staff are going to massage the wording. So we've got two different opinions here. So to me, it's just not an and or.
So you do not like the used subsidized directors' personal or business activities?
I think it's an ethical issue for directors. I don't think we have to tell them they cannot do this. They cannot do that. I mean, it's an ethical issue. And I just trying to take the negative out of some of the guidelines. Let's talk about what they can do, not what they can't do.
Yeah, I think Ms. Campbell.
The chair to Director Brown and the rest of the committee. So I mean, we can try and massage the language, but I wouldn't want to take away from the actual principle that we've committed to building into this policy, which UBCM, I don't want to slaughter what UBCM has worked hard to come up with. So if there's a way to change the wording a bit so that it doesn't take away from the meaning, but perhaps doesn't sound harsh if some directors feel like it sounds harsh. And I do want to just emphasize again that the intent is really not to say that this is a problem. That's why we've built this in here. It's a really great way to start a policy with guiding principles. This is what this policy is built upon. And again, because it's public facing, we want the public to see that, legitimately directors absolutely should be able to claim for expenses incurred as part of their job, but ensuring we're balancing that with, being accountable to the taxpayers, and it's not perceived, there's not a perception that they're getting additional compensation from those expenses.
Thank you. And I think putting the footnote saying that this is not us who has come up with this particular wording, this is UBCM. So this is a generally accepted principle or practice in local government. And also, I don't think our feelings really come into the matter here, or how we might feel about it. This is what we need to say, be saying to the public. This is for them, not for us, in a lot of ways. Director Schaefer.
If you want to leave the wording in there, why don't we put as per UBCM regulations, such and such, and then go forward with it? You know, instead of just leaving it at, because to me, that's very insulting to me. I feel like you're saying that I cheat and I don't.
We could put in some wording that in accordance with UBCM's principles on board remuneration expenses, and then follow up, either a footnote or sort of prefacing the principle with that where it comes from. Yep.
And Mr. Ray.
Yeah, just following up on what Ms. Campbell said, I think, you know, I'm looking at this section of the policy a little differently than what I'm hearing some of the directors look at it. It's a guiding principle. This is not a statement that is directed at the directors to say, you know, hey, you guys need to follow this, right? It's an opening principle. So this is a statement from the board to the public saying, this is our philosophy on how we've constructed this policy. It's a statement to say, this is a statement from the board saying, this is how we're conducting ourselves.
Yep, I know. Okay, Director Stamer, and then I saw Director Gillis. I did see another hand online, but it seems to have gone. So Director Stamer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I wasn't planning on going through every single portion of this report. I'm quite satisfied for what Mr. Ray has presented so far. My concern was again back to the kilometer rate, and we get a chance to talk about that. I've got a couple of points I'd like to make on that, regardless of what the CRA has to chat about. So when we get to that point, will you please let me know?
Thank you. And Director Gillis?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In respect to what Mr. Ray has just said, that this is a statement from the board to the public. Now I am concerned about the implication or the inferences that may be drawn from that wording. I mean, are we in kindergarten here? It looks to me to be accusatory. And so now if this is to be a statement from the board to the public, I certainly hope that this matter of not to be considered an extra source of remuneration or used to subsidize a director's personal or business activities. Now I'm finding it increasingly offensive, and I hope it will be massaged.
Director Quinn?
Am I there? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, good, thank you. I just want to point out that all through this, as we go through this, on the Dunwoody report, not one director was found to be violating the expense accounts. I'm sure that if we were, that would have been flagged. So I don't think we're doing that badly. And I do have I kind of tend to agree with Chair Gillis on it's kind of making it look accusatory, and we shouldn't be doing that. I do have a question when we get to point 2.8. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, if I could just jump in here as well, like we do this with the utmost of respect. This is best practice coming from UBCM, that regional districts, municipalities are following the exact same principles and guidelines. So to be unique with the TNRD, I'm not sure why we'd want to just stray away from that one. I know, and I say this with respect as well, but during the BDO audit, which we spent hours and days and weeks on as staff, it was quite clear that we had a lot of policies, regulations, best practices that were too vague. And that's where we got into some of the problems we did. And I think we need to be really clear on kind of what the expectations are going forward. And it's not, we're certainly not trying to offend anybody at all. We're trying to be respectful, and we're trying to do it in a way that would be similar to that other regional districts, other municipalities across the province. So just my 2 cents.
Thank you. Any further discussion on 1.1, 1.2? Seems pretty straightforward. She said, hopefully. Expenses 2.1. Any comments on 2.1 about reasonable food, accommodation, and travel expenses? Two point two. Schedule of allowable expenses, which we can talk about if we need to when we get there. 2.3, most economical mode of transportation is to be used. I like the plane on that picture personally, but that's just me. The little Nash Rambler. So anything on 2.3? Director Schaefer.
Are we going to take out that regardless at the end? Are we leaving it in?
Yeah, I don't see why.
Yep, we can,
I don't think it's
to
necessary.
allow for some exceptions, yep, we can change that language.
And I think something to remember here is that we could sit here all day and not possibly come up with every possible conceivable permutation of events. So there will be, I'm sure, unique situations that can be discussed if they arise. 2.4, travel accommodation, standard room. Director Rothenberger.
It's not, this is good as far as it goes, but I'm still not sure it goes quite far enough. And I've said before, I understand the difficulty in booking accommodation because the rates vary so much. They vary from city to city and from season to season, and you never know about availability and what the rate's going to be at a particular hotel. But I still think we need to not assume that our first choice will always be the convention hotel if there is accommodation nearby. You know, I've been to conventions where I've had to take the bus to because you're talking quite a distance in some cases. Most of the time it's been within walking distance, but I don't think it's unreasonable for us to look outside the immediate zone of the convention for rates. And that's all I'm saying. And I don't know how you write that into a policy or whether that's more practice than policy. But I mean, there are bargains to be had for, you can find rooms for less than $500 or $600. You don't have to pay the top rate all the time.
CAO Hildebrand and then Director Gillis.
Thank you. Just in response to that, that is our practice. Like I know when I talk with Katie, and Katie does a lot of the booking, she's always looking for efficiencies. I was looking for somewhere nearby, but keeping it within walking distance and trying to be efficient with our taxpayer money.
Director Gillis.
Thank you, Chair Roden. And the question here that was put to me by Director Kershaw, who unfortunately, because of medical urgency in his family, can't be here today. I've discussed this with Mr. Hildebrand and Ms. Campbell too, and I know the intention is not to have us seeking out the lowest level flea pit motel that may possibly be available, but at the same time, I'm kind of hoping that might be clarified in the final draft of this, because it says, as things stand right now, they should be booked at the lowest rate, and maybe be a little more specific about what the lowest rate is without having us fighting bed bugs. Thank you.
Okay,
Can that be done, Ms. Campbell?
so help to Brand or Miss Campbell?
Certainly it can be done, but government rate is typically a relatively good room, and most of the hotels that you're referring to, Chair Gillis, are not even in our purview when we're trying to book them.
I think it's the lowest rate available at the hotel that you're preferring to stay at, provided that it's not a hotel that's, $800 a night. So if it's a conference, then potentially the hotel that the conference is in, or the hotel nearby. If the hotel nearby is suitable, then it would be the lowest rate at that hotel nearby. So I'm not sure if there's a way to make it any clearer, but I think as staff who are going to be processing this, I think we understand the intent of it. Mhm.
Yeah, oh, okay, I did understand what you said when we discussed it, was it yesterday or whatever, and I'm not concerned about it. I did want to bring the concern forward on behalf of Director Kershaw, and he thought perhaps it could be a little more specific, that's all.
Thank you. Director Stamer?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, just to chime into what Chair Gillis has mentioned. I mean, this isn't our first rodeo. I mean, we know that certain locations are a lot more expensive than others, whether it's Whistler or Victoria or places like that. But we all know that there's significant benefits in staying at or near conference centers, notwithstanding even transportation costs back and forth. And yes, we're all conscious of the fact that we're trying to get the best bang for our taxpayers as we can. Case in point, the last UBCM that we had in Vancouver, the District of Barrier, we ended up getting an Airbnb at the top of one of the skyscrapers right across from Rogers Arena, and the SkyTrain was right there. But having said that, there are significant benefits, and those hotels that are putting on the conferences know that as well. And it was cheaper for us to stay at the Prestige at Silva than it was at any of the other hotels. And I just wanted to point that out, that we don't really need to be having to be, like, as Chair Gillis mentioned, we don't have to be looking for a Super 8 every time that we're trying to go there and then have to worry about getting a cab back and forth or having mobility issues. So thanks for that.
So that is 2.4 accommodation. Also too, in my experience with conventions, the locations that we're going to, Vancouver, Whistler, Victoria, staff will know what hotels to avoid based on what they might have heard from the past. And places like FCM in Quebec City, convention organizers are usually pretty good about scouting out the area hotels, and they will tell you which ones are on the list they would recommend. They're not going to recommend the local flea pit. It's going to be decent accommodation at worst. All right, 2.5 per diem rates. Oh, my goodness, hands. Director Rothenberger, then Director Walsh.
I'm just looking for a little clarification, more than anything, and I note that the per diem now becomes the maximum, and I believe that is a change from the past, is it not? So I like that we're putting a maximum on it, but I still wonder about per diems at all versus submitting receipts up to a maximum instead of the per diem approach, and whether that's simply an administrative convenience of the per diems, or whether there's some other good reason that we go per diems instead of actual receipts up to a maximum amount. Because if you've got a per diem of $25 for breakfast, I believe it was, and you spend $15, there's going to be a tendency, well, I'll have, maybe juice and a piece of toast and make myself 10 or 15 bucks. Not saying people are going to do that, but it becomes an extra expense that's not necessary. So now I just question that. And also, just for clarification regarding meals being paid by individuals in group situations. So I like that as well, but that would include, for example, if a bunch of directors decide to go across the street to the Dorian for lunch between meetings. Previously, if there's an administrator involved in that meal, that would go on their card. But now it will be handled individually and we would each with our own credit cards or cash pay for the meal and then submit expenses. That's the intent.
Yes.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
As-
And so, but my question about per diems versus receipts.
Yeah, per diems are a common way of processing these types of expenses, not just with local governments or other levels of government, but in private business a lot of the time as well. You're right. There's a trade-off of saying potentially some individuals might be deciding to, reduce the amount of what they'd be spending and pocket the difference, or potentially maximize the amount they're spending when they otherwise might not. The flip side to it is, the practice applies to staff as well as to directors. So the amount of extra work administratively to be chasing down any instances where a receipt is lost or missing, to do the reconciliation and do the extra work involved with processing receipts instead of per diems, could end up being enough extra work where, and I can tell you our accounts payable staff right now are working very hard to keep up with the amount of work we already have. And as we keep adding more and more services and more work, my fear is that kind of change would actually necessitate additional staff. So you weigh the extra cost of an additional body versus, the potential that there's a few extra dollars being spent on a per diem.
Thank you, Director Walsh.
Yeah, I guess, so the clarification here is now you used to require receipts and now you don't, right? Okay, so that's for efficiencies, but yeah, I think we need to have two different rates because, these rates are excessive. They're probably somewhat in line with if you're staying at the Pacific Palisades and you're eating in Vancouver. But I went out for dinner last night and it cost me $26 and I had a drink, right? So to me, the rates there should be two. There should be a rate, a basic rate, which I consider even almost half of what those rates are. And then if you have receipts, there's no extra work involved. If your receipt was over for dinner was $60, the max you're going to get is going to be $45, right? So you would put on your expense form that you attach to receipt that's $60. So you justify for the second level, which was the max of $45. Because I don't purposely go out for $45. There is obviously that's the reality now in some cases, but on a convention, yes, but on a regular, like a visit to Kamloops here for a meeting, for a regular directors meeting, I think those rates are excessive. So I think there should be two tiers, one without receipts and one justifying because your receipt is actually excessive than the higher rate. And then there's no real extra work involved from the accounting other than verifying that there was a receipt attached to the claim. So to me, that's a problem. And then I just want to ask too, is if I go to Vancouver to use Fcm and I stay at my brother's, I get $50 a night per diem. But then do I get to claim $100 on top of that for breakfast, lunch, dinner? Or, if I come back from the meeting at dinner and I can claim $45 at my brother's, like at what point does it get kind of distorted, I would say?
I would assume that if you were staying with your brother and he cooked you dinner, you're not out of pocket for that dinner, so you don't claim. That's how I would understand it. And if you wanted to give your brother the $50 out of the goodness of your heart because you're using his towels and his laundry and he's cooking you dinner and everything, then you could do that.
Exactly.
Okay, but it just, the way it's written, though, you could claim per diem for, I just think there should be a level, two different levels. One with receipts that are excessive and one without receipts. Because you did talk about having one
in the regular interior versus Vancouver too at one point, right? That was a discussion. Okay. That's all. That's.
Director Gillis?
Yes, in response to that, Chair Roden, I agree with what you said before. We can analyze every remote possibility here, but maybe you decide because your brother was kind enough to accommodate you, perhaps you decide to take him out for dinner. There's no end of possibilities. And you attach your $60 receipt to your expense form for your $45 dinner, but then Mr. Ray's staff has to analyze it to see whether you had a beer with it or was there any wine on that, which of course is not allowed. It goes on endlessly and endlessly and endlessly, and I suggest we leave it as it is.
Thank you. As someone who did work accounts payable for School District 74 for a year, the thing I dreaded was chasing people up, especially Board of Trustees members. For some reason, they were the worst at providing receipts. That is tedious. It is frustrating. In some cases, it is impossible because the receipt has been lost. Are you now going to make the person in question go back to the restaurant or the hotel or wherever and say, I need a copy of this receipt, otherwise I'm not going to get reimbursed? And it does come down, I find, to a question of staff time. When does it now become onerous for staff to have to be chasing directors for a receipt for $11.73 for a Big Mac and a coffee, or a Egg McMuffin and a coffee? Just my 2 cents from someone who's been in the payables trenches. Director Brown.
Thank you. One of the things I want to mention was the CRA rate. We take the CRA rate for the mileage because that is reasonable according to the Government of Canada. And it's not a taxable benefit at that point. Anything beyond that could potentially be taxable. Well, they also have acceptable meal rates, and their total comes to $113.50 with an incidental in there that isn't attached to each of the meals. Canada Revenue's rates are applicable, or an average, or some suggested number for every place in Canada, for every resident in Canada. I don't understand why it's acceptable for us to use the gas rate, but not the meal rate. And I guess BDO stressed that we were exceeding our limits on per diems. They never once stated that those per diems were too high. They stated that we were overriding those limits. I just want to know why we're not using the Canada revenue rate. And in addition to that, the CPI index is going to hit us like no tomorrow this year. We're looking at least 8 to 10% on everything going up.
Yep.
And yet we are looking at reducing our reimbursement.
Sorry.
I don't understand it. And I just need some kind of explanation on that.
Ms. Campbell, Mr.
Well,
Ray.
maybe Mr. Ray wants to take it, but the per diem amounts are higher now. And Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but now with the removal of the incidentals, which I believe very few directors ever claimed for because we don't really use fax machines or have to pay for using phones when traveling. But the breakfast, lunch, and dinners are quite a bit higher now than they were previously, but I'll let Mr. Ray comment.
Yeah, the rates for the breakfast, lunch, and dinner are higher. What we had before was a rate of $100 with lower amounts for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and about $36 for incidentals. And you got that incidental when you claimed for the entire day, whether you had incurred incidental expenses or not. So, my first approach at it was to say, if we're going to have these meal rates be a cap on what can be expensed and set an upper limit, which was a BDO recommendation, it should be a reasonable amount. My feeling at the time was the individual amounts for breakfast, lunch, and dinner as they were too low. And it's also harder to justify that incidental amount because a lot of those incidental costs have disappeared over the years. So the idea was to increase the breakfast, lunch, and dinner and remove the incidental amount. Now, the initial pass was to suggest continuing with the two-tiered rate, but at a lower amount. Revisiting that, we thought the better compromise. And again, I reviewed a sample of actual directors' claims from 2019, comparing the old rates of what they actually would have received versus what the new rates would supply. And where there were a lot of directors who were not necessarily claiming an overnight stay and not claiming the incidental amount as a result, but only claiming for meals, they would in fact, in most cases, come away with a little bit more money under the $100 daily rate that we're recommending today versus the previous two-tiered rate.
I'm asking why not the Canada Revenue acceptable meal rate across the country as opposed to what we've come up with. We
See,
used the rate for kilometer reimbursement.
So the Canada Revenue Agency rates, you're right, it ties it to another third-party rate, just like we do for the automobiles. It still includes a significant incidental component, which again, you know, I just don't like, because I think when we're faced with questions about why are we paying this incidental, what does it cover, I struggle to come up with a good answer. And if I take away that incidental amount, it's less than $100 a day. So on balance, we said if we're not going to have an incidental component to it, $100 a day seems to be the right level in terms of, you know, a compromise between what we're seeing other local governments using, which is generally lower than $100 a day, and the prices we're seeing, the inflation we're facing, all of those things, and comparing it to what the end result would be, which again was not intended to reduce the amount of money that directors are being reimbursed, but to structure it differently in a more clear and straightforward way.
If I can give you a, for instance, from my perspective, $45 dinner includes probably tip of about, what, 20%? $8 of that is probably for a tip, and
Right.
put another percentage for your GST. We're not looking at a $45 meal. We're talking about inclusive. And when you bring that down to $35, you've got a drink as well, whether it's coffee or whatever, they're $4 or $5 in restaurants. And I don't go to fast food restaurants. I've got too many allergies. I don't use fast food, and I can't use toast for breakfast. So I have to have a restaurant that serves me gluten-free meals. And when I look at that, when you include the tip and the taxes, the meal cost is not that significant. And maybe the incidentals could be used for tips and stuff like that. And that's what they have been used in the past. I'm just saying, we use CRA for one component. Why don't we use it for both components? That's my question.
CO Hildebrand.
Thank you. Just if I could jump into that as well, we just, I guess the fact was we felt like the CRA rate was too high based on the analysis we did. We actually reached out to every village, city in the TNRD, and there wasn't one that was close to that rate, and felt like based on Doug's analysis and everything Doug has said, that we felt like that was a fair amount. And especially when it was compared back to 2018 or 2019, we just still felt like it would be a fair per diem rate. So we did our homework and made sure we looked at every city and every regional district and municipality, and there wasn't any that were, there may be a few, but we were the high end at 120 or even at 100.
Director Gillis.
Thank you again. And I had some notes with respect to 2.6, so I'll deal with them at the same time as 2.5, because I think 2.6 is just a reiteration really of 2.5. And my concern is that I have two actually, but with respect to the question of meals that are provided, that is probably the one to which I object the most strenuously. In the first place, it's not necessarily a meal that anybody would want to eat. In my experience, I've had some experience with some of these wonderful breakfasts that are supplied as part of a convention program, and I just got up at one point and walked out and went to a restaurant. By the way, the breakfast at the restaurant in Vancouver 5 years ago or whenever it was $26.95 before tax, before tip. And I'm not sure that included coffee, but that's just an aside. I absolutely object to the notion that simply because some bagel and biscuit is offered as allegedly as breakfast, that we should be precluded from going and getting our own breakfast. And I would ask that it go back to what the wording was on our old expense form, which was with the exception of meals partaken as opposed to offered. And I think that's vitally important. And with respect to Director Brown's comment, there's another matter. People have allergies, and the stuff that is provided or offered may indeed not be acceptable to every member, and every member may not even be capable of digesting that stuff. So that I am most adamant about that. It must go back to with the exception of meals partaken rather than those offered.
Okay, thank you. So this is all kind of new to me. So yes, Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Chair Roden, through to Chair Gillis. So I mean, Doug and I and Scott can talk about that. I think we'd be creating a different standard though, an expectation for staff, because currently staff are not able to claim for meals if they're provided the meal at the conference. So for example, I was recently at the Togma conference. Meals were built into the cost of my registration. And so I couldn't claim meals, and they did accommodate me. I do have a number of dietary restrictions as well, and they were really great about accommodating me. I realize that not all conferences may be as good about that, but we are trying to create some alignment between our board expense policy and our staff expense policy. And I would just be concerned about creating a different expectation of staff and the board, but certainly maybe Mr. Ray has some comments. We can look at that, and this policy will obviously be going forward to the entire board, so other members can weigh in, or if other members of the committee have comments on that.
And I think here too, again, I mean, for some people, breakfast, a bagel and a cup of coffee is a perfectly acceptable breakfast. It's probably more than they have at home, or granola and an orange juice. For some people, it's bacon, egg, sausage, scrambled eggs, hash browns, the whole works. That's a breakfast. Yes, Chair Gillis agrees with me. So again, you're coming up with all these different permutations and ideas, which we cannot possibly encompass in any one document without it being War and Peace in length. I think Vice Chair Brown raises a good point about allergies. And I think, again, that might have to be on a case-by-case basis. There might be places that are less than accommodating for people with severe or extensive allergies. And I think possibly, given that, a director who has those, is in that position, might need to talk to staff about what can we do. I go and the breakfast is scrambled eggs and sausage and everything in those horrible chafing dishes that don't keep anything hot. And I can't eat any of it. And there's no accommodation. That again might be something that an individual director can talk to staff about to come to an accommodation that will suit them without having to write some long convoluted something in a policy that tries to cover every possible base and can't. I don't know, is that doable?
Chair Roden, yeah, I believe we could probably build some language in there, Doug, where there's exceptions. If you go to a conference, like say I had gone to Tolgma and they couldn't accommodate my restrictions, well, then I would have had nothing to eat. So I would have had to go out. And I think in a case like that, I would let finance know in claiming my per diems that yes, this was provided. However, they were not able to accommodate me. And so I did have to claim for meals that I partook in outside of the conference.
I have Director Walsh and then Director Gillis.
I just want to go back. Well, I just think we're trying to do this, especially the per diem thing is a one size fits all, but people have certain diet accommodations, et cetera. Okay, you're talking about breakfast.
Breakfast to me is a coffee and a muffin if it is at the most, right, for breakfast. So
It only allows me to claim $25. But that may cost me $10, right? So there's no
options available. It's you either go full claim breakfast and then I'm basically making $15 if I claim it, or I don't claim it and I lose 10. Like there's nothing to really create any kind of, where you look at the whole thing and say, okay, that's not really right. So I'll just maybe I'll claim every 2 breakfasts or something as one breakfast. But so I don't think this really covers it properly.
Chair Gillis?
Yeah, with respect to your comment, I agree. There's no way we will end up with a convoluted document if we try to accommodate everything. But it seems to me that the substitution of the word partaken is a pretty simple solution, is it not, Ms. Campbell? Wouldn't that work? And why wouldn't it work for staff just as well as it would work for directors? If staff partake, then the meal is supplied. If they partake of it, then they're not reimbursed for it. If they don't partake, then they're entitled to their per diem. Is that not a simple solution?
So it's an administrative policy, so that's up to Mr. Hildebrand. But the idea again behind it was that the TNRD is paying an additional cost with the registration for meals to be included, right? And so oftentimes you don't have the option. Some conferences you do, you can choose, I just want to participate conference only or conference and meals. But where you don't have that choice and it's built in, the concern for both staff and board was that we're paying this additional cost of the conference, which includes meals, and then we're also reimbursing you for additional meals. And so again, I guess for the administrative policy side of things, we're working on revising that staff expense policy anyways, so that it aligns with what we're doing here. So Mr. Hildebrand can.
We're just trying
look
looking
at
for
that.
consistency, and we'd like to have it the same for the board as it is for the staff. And that was been our goal as we kind of go through this, to make sure it's simplified and easy to understand.
Director Rothenberger, Director Schaefer.
Well, just speaking in opposition to Director Gillis's proposal, the problem with it is that the TNRD, i.e. the taxpayers, end up paying an extra amount if somebody doesn't happen to like the bagels that are provided, say at UBCM conventions, where it's common that you go down for breakfast and it's part of the cost of the registration and so on. So if you say, well, I don't happen to like that, I'm going to go out for breakfast and get my own. Well, that every penny of that you're submitting for is an extra expense to taxpayers. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to put reasonable restrictions on ourselves that are palatable to the taxpayers. Not, and I get a sense here, Chair, that we're resisting this stuff instead of promoting it and trying to put reasonable restrictions on ourselves. So I have a concern about the kind of tone that's coming out of this meeting, and that every point that comes up seems to be, well, that doesn't fit my situation, or it's not enough, or we should go with a higher rate. I'll stop there. I'll shut up.
Right, Director Gillis? Oh, no, okay. Oh, Director Schaefer, I'm sorry. I knew there was a hand over there.
I'd just like to say that I attended Silga and the breakfasts were god awful. They were cold. They weren't edible as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I didn't claim for breakfast, but they were terrible breakfasts. they weren't, you know, they had everything you wanted. It's just that they were all cold.
Thank you. I was at Silga, it was fine. I don't normally eat breakfast, so everything that was there, it was edible plus. It was, I'm not saying it was, you know, Escoffier Michelin starred stuff, but it was fine. And I think too, yeah, we have to sometimes, obviously there are cases, as with Vice Chair Brown, where people have severe allergies. That will always need to be accommodated, and I'm sure we always can. If you look at the buffet table and you think, oh, those scrambled eggs look a bit rubbery. It's one breakfast. Someone else has cooked it and will clean up after you, and you're not paying for it. So I'm sure you can find some strawberries and a muffin for one morning. Sorry, that's just me. Otherwise you start sounding really special. Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I take exception a little bit on what one of the comments was about reasonable, because, you know, I don't know why we keep beating this up about this per diem, and we all know what it costs to go out for breakfast and that. And I agree with it, Silga. I mean, one of the lunches we had, I had a cold burger, and I also had a cold beer, which I paid for, which was the only part that was actually good in the lunch. And one of the breakfasts that was advertised for hot wasn't hot. So I'm hoping that, you know, we can agree that we're all going to be reasonable in being able to achieve whatever we need for a dietary supplement on that. And because, you know, I like to ask Director Rothenberger in some cases, would our taxpayers eat some of these breakfasts that they're throwing out there as perceived as being included, when really that's not what we wanted for that meal. So I think it's more than fair that if you do participate, you don't have to have it, you don't expense for it. If you don't, you do. I don't see that I don't know why we're going around and around in circles on this, because I don't think it's really necessary. And I think that a lot of our taxpayers would be shocked to see what we actually have to eat on some of these conferences, what they throw out there at us, and we eat it because that's the most convenient way to get something to eat. It's not the cost, it's just the convenience.
Thank you, Director Stamer. I'll just play devil's advocate and say a lot of our taxpayers would probably be very grateful to see what was provided to us for breakfast at some of these conferences. And would be happy to eat it.
If I may, Chair, from what I've seen, people's expectations and what they expect, I would think that they would probably, some of them would differ on that. And again, I'm not saying Silga was terrible, but it could have been a whole lot better than what was there. And again, I don't know why we're even having this conversation. I mean, in so many cases, as Director Brown points out, you know, in one case we get compensated because that's what's in a report on CRA, and then the other one we don't. So I'd like to get to 3.1 as quickly as we can and discuss that with Mr. Ray, because I think that their CARA is totally out to lunch.
All right, I think we're going to move on from 2.5 and 2.6. There is a suggestion that we change 2.6, that the director participated in, or that was otherwise provided to them, to, I guess, in which the director partook. Or is the consensus that we are happy to leave 2.5 and 2.6 as they are, with the proviso that anyone with severe allergies who is not being accommodated or it's not being accommodated can obviously make an exception, can go and talk to staff and say, look, this is why I'm submitting a lunch receipt when lunch was provided for us, because there was nothing there I could eat, quite literally.
Chair Roden. So 2.5, I don't think 2.5 is different from 2.6. So for 2.6, I do think we could probably build in maybe some language that ultimately, again, this will go to the board and it'll be up to the board to decide. I think we keep the language as is, and that expectation as is, with exceptions, provided that they can't accommodate an allergy or a dietary restriction, or if it really is, a breakfast that is absolutely not edible, then a claim would be submitted for meals that were partaken outside of the conference, with maybe an explanation provided to finance on the claim form. Meals were provided, however, I was not able to, partake in this meal. Hopefully that's a compromise.
And Director Walsh, did you have a?
So in some of these conventions, you can't opt out of the meals included? Like, I thought that was when you're registered, you could decide whether or not at that point.
Some you can, and some you can't. So some conferences, you'll see that you can just hit conference only, or conference and meals. But a lot of conferences, it's automatically built in to the cost of the conference.
So directors with
So there's
diet
an example.
concerns could opt out in some cases. at the
Oh,
beginning.
absolutely, yeah.
So
yeah.
that would be encouraged somehow, whether it's in this policy or not.
Yeah, and we can, when our executive assistant is booking and registering directors, she can remind directors that they have an option. So are you attending the conference only, or do you also want to participate in the meals? Because that would be helpful for her when she's registering directors.
And Director Gillis.
I would move that we recommend to the board that item 2.6 be deleted from the recommended policy.
Seconder for that motion? Director Schaefer, all right, any discussion on the motion that we strike 2.6 from this proposed policy?
I do. Well, I'm just concerned that then we're going to be double billing, like in the sense of if it's included. I just have a problem with that you can claim the per diem rate even if the meal's offered.
Chair Roden, I have my hand up, please.
Okay, Director Stamer, sorry.
Yes, thank you. I'll speak to that motion because I was thinking that maybe what we could do is, one of the suggestions could be is that, let's say the meal doesn't meet expectations, or there is a dietary issue or something like that. Why don't we just put in there that you do, because I mean, sometimes those meals are included, sometimes they're not. It's different than if you're let's say there's a meal, like you've paid for a dinner and you go to the dinner and it doesn't meet your expectation. That's one thing. Normally what we're talking about is breakfast and lunch. So why don't we put in the 2.6 to say that in certain circumstances, including dietary, those kinds of things, that you can claim up to the per diem amount with a receipt in that instance. In other words, if the breakfast doesn't meet your expectation or it doesn't meet your dietary requirements, you could get the breakfast up to our per diem cost, but it has to have a receipt. Up to. How is that as for a compromise?
Hey, Director Gillis.
Thank you. I don't know, procedurally, I'm in Ms. Campbell's hands and to a certain extent in my seconder's hands. But what I would like to do is withdraw the motion and propose an amendment to item 2.6. How do I go about that, Ms. Campbell?
You just did, Chair Gillis, as long as Director Schaefer's, the seconder is okay with your withdrawal.
Thank you. In that case, I would move that we amend item 2.6 to say the per diem rate may not be claimed for any meals that are included and partaken in as part of an itinerary of a meeting and so on and so forth.
I'll second that.
Sorry, what was the amended 2.6?
2.6, it was just to add the words behind included, add the words and partaken.
Director Bass?
Thank you. We're still creating a situation where we're double dipping into the taxpayers' money. And I gotta say, I agree with Director Rothenberger. I'm kind of embarrassed at this conversation. Like this isn't about us. This is about boards. You know, and I guess I just trust our staff to know what they're doing. And I think that what has just been proposed is just taking more money from the taxpayers that we shouldn't be taking.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I was looking at 2.6 and thinking of a possible amendment would be the per diem rate should not be claimed for any meals, except in extenuating circumstances, unless there are extenuating circumstances, which would cover people with serious allergies or food difficulties. It would cover if the breakfast was totally inedible garbage, etc. But it would lessen the fact that the possibility, I think, of someone saying, well, the muffins aren't quite what I was looking for. I was hoping for bagels or something, I don't know. Because I think we do have to realize that we are spending taxpayers' money and that we may not get precisely the
point of
breakfast that we
order?
would order for ourselves if we were in a restaurant. But
Point of order, are you making an amendment or are you speaking to the,
I was speaking to the suggested amendment that because I don't, we do not have a motion on the floor, do we? Pardon me?
We do from,
Okay.
from Chair Gillis. So it's that we amend item 6.2 to include the word partaken in.
Director Stamer, sorry.
Yeah, thank Madam Chair. I don't know where this idea of this double dipping is coming from, because again, there's a distinction between whether you've paid extra for having say a dinner meeting on a Thursday night and you're going to pay the $50 or $75 or whatever that is part of the conference, and then having a breakfast that supposedly is provided and it not even meets your doesn't meet your dietary requirements. I don't know why we keep going around talking about double dipping. There's no double dipping going on. And in most cases, a lot of us don't even claim it in the first place. It's not worth our time. Certainly not worth my time. But I'm just suggesting that if we were going to have an amendment to that, if we were going to be able to allow that bit of flexibility, you'd have to have a receipt. End of story. I don't know why we keep going around and around about this big waste of money and all the rest of it when we're creating something that hasn't occurred and it isn't occurring. So I don't know why we can't just get on with it.
Director Rothenberger?
Okay, without criticizing another director, we're not going around and around. It's a very important issue. And the fact is the proposed amendment sets up an opportunity for double dipping, which should not be there.
It's not double dipping.
I'm sorry, but it is if you're adding an expense that's unnecessary during conference. And I think that's the example we're talking about. If a meal is provided and you don't like that meal, or you have an anticipation that you're not going to like that meal, then you are double dipping if you are allowed by policy to go out and have a breakfast or other meal all on your own. That is an extra expense to the taxpayer. That is double dipping. It's a classic definition of double dipping. If there is a legitimate reason, such as dietary needs that are not provided by a particular meal that's included, then that's a different situation. But to leave it permissive in the sense that you can take it or leave it at your own preference, that creates double dipping. And we shouldn't go there, period.
Thank you. I think just double dipping, it's not double dipping by the director. I think just a clarification, it is charging in effect the taxpayer twice for the same meal. It's being paid for as part of the convention, and then it is being paid for again because the person put in a separate expense claim for it. Director Gillis?
Yes, if we're going to get into petty details, most of the breakfasts and so on that are supplied at the UBCM convention are supplied compliments of Young Anderson or some other firm. So I'm not sure that we're really paying for them in the first place with our registration.
All right, so we do have a motion to amend item 2.6. So I'm going to call the question. All those in favor of the amendment? We have directors Brown, Schaefer, and Gillis. And I can't see Director Stamer. All those opposed to the amendment? We have 4, Directors Quinn and Stamer. Because we could not see you and you did not vote no, then you are deemed to have voted yes. Is that
Thank you. I was
correct,
going to vote yes anyway.
Sorry,
Okay.
yes, yes, yes.
All right, so can I just do that again, please, so that we can just get hands up? All those in favor of the amendment? So we have Directors Stamer, Quinn, Brown, Schaefer, and Gillis. All those opposed? Directors Walsh, Bass, Rothenberger, and Roden. So the motion is carried. All right, we move on to 2.7. Ms. Campbell?
Chair Roden, sorry to interrupt. Just so the committee is aware, we're on a bit of a time crunch because IT has to shut the system down because we're having some issues with our network at 12:20. So I just,
So no pressure then, everyone, no pressure.
They just sent me a text and I gave the okay because I thought we'd be done by then. So just not to rush, but it will shut down.
Okay, so 2.7, any discussion on 2.7 or is it good as it stands? Director Quinn, is that a legacy hand or do you have something on 2.7?
No, it's 2.8. I was anticipating 2.8.
He wants to get to the head of the queue. All right, so we'll move on to 2.8. Director Quinn, I suspect you have something to say.
Yeah, this particular thing says directors that are travel away from their home community can have a lunch, say it's at a 1:30 meeting. If meetings go beyond 4 or 5 o'clock, which has been happening in the past, it means that directors such as Director Rice and Director Watson and myself don't get home till 7 or 8 o'clock at night. So I've always charged supper. Does that need to be clarified or do we just keep going for the next director? Thank you.
Pardon me?
That would be obvious and that's what we would expect. Before or after, I guess you could say. Yeah, we can change that.
Yeah. Do you need a
Director
formal
Schaefer?
amendment?
No, we'll just change that.
Great, thank you.
I was pretty well the same. I just wanted to know because it just says before. So we're
So
gonna put
before
after
or
as well?
after the meeting itself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. This seems to be quite popular that we all claim. Just on behalf of servers everywhere, please tell them in advance that everyone at the table would like a separate check rather than waiting till the end of the meal. They will thank you. Vice Chair Brown?
I just wanted to ask that the words rather than expecting TNR to staff to pay on their behalf be taken out. We can state that we're all paying individually, but
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so we'll strike rather than expecting TNRD staff to pay on their behalf. 2.10 or 2.10. Two point 11. 3.1 travel Vice Chair Brown.
So Doug, we could include those just to make sure we captured all meetings. That's your expectation. Okay, great.
Thank you. In addition to that, for schedule B, I had regular or special meetings because we have had several special meetings recently. I don't know if the out of town meeting needs to be classed as a special meeting or something on its own because it's a regular meeting, but there's more to it than just a regular meeting. So travel expenses, 3.1. Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yes, and just as a comment, I wasn't suggesting in the previous conversation that people could willy-nilly decide whether they like the meal or not. That's not what I was saying. I said it was with a dietary requirement, restriction, or something like that. So I take offense on that. Back to the 3.1 to Mr. Ray. Doug, where are we in being able to contact CRA? Because I just did some quick math here. And depending between 2021 and 2022, where the fuel was $1.34 to 206, which is a 65% increase. And even if you factor in the fuel is only 50% of that rate, does that mean that we're going to have a 90 cent per kilometer rate in 2023? I mean, I understand it's not a business expense, below the 61 threshold, but if businesses can have a fuel surcharge and write that off as a business expense, you'd think that the CRA would be having a phone call about what are we going to do about some of these discrepancies? I mean, it's 6 months worth of a discrepancy between, it could be 70 cents, 80 cents, or 90 cents. Where are we at being able to contact them on that?
I can do so, but I don't hold out a lot of hope that CRA is going to respond.
But how about officially? Because I mean, we're talking significant, maybe not for some of us, but for others, it certainly is. And we're going to be looking at another 6 months of a significant cost that we're not going to be able to recover. So how do we work that? I mean, so many other businesses, when they get to a certain threshold, they have a fuel surcharge. Why isn't the CRA looking at something like this?
Yeah, I can't answer on CRA's behalf.
I know, but is there a way that we can find out if they're even thinking about that, or are they just going to wait for the sticker shock and give us 85 cents next January?
Well, again, I can contact them. I just don't hold out a lot of hope that they'll respond. They may be looking at, other possibilities. I've heard discussion of, rebates provided or tax credits provided through various mechanisms to, help make up for the increase in not just fuel, but other cost of living prices.
But just to further on that, wouldn't it be easy for them to be able to say, this is the threshold and you can add something to that? Or is that just too convoluted for them or too complicated for them?
Again, I can't answer on CRA's behalf.
No, I understand that.
Yeah. But I can do some more investigation on what other local governments are doing to address the issue.
Great. Thanks very much for that.
Anything else on 3.1? 3.2? Director Schaefer?
Could you please explain to me a business related to both the respective municipalities and the TNRD?
Well, the idea, I guess, with that wording, when it was originally written, was that a municipal director may be traveling on a meeting where they're representing both their municipality and conducting TNRD business. So it's not mutually exclusive, one or the other. As long as the travel had some TNRD component to it, we would allow it. We just wanted to make it clear they couldn't be charging things to the TNRD where they were really there representing their municipality, which I don't think they would do anyway.
No, neither do I, but I mean, wouldn't the municipality be paying for that?
Well, because if they're also conducting TNRD business, it may make sense that the TNRD would pay the cost, depending on, like the municipal component could be a very minor component of it.
I think one example of that, if I could just share that, would be if there was a if there was a municipal director that was maybe going to a public hearing that was in an electoral area, maybe they're in Mel's or something area that would maybe TNRD business versus the municipal business. So we've done that in the past, I've seen. So could be example of like that.
Vice Chair Brown?
That, or even a number of the different agreements that we have to determine. And I guess it would depend on who would call it, what the issues are. I mean, we wouldn't put an expense into TNRD unless I don't know what. But I would like to ask for the title of this session to be called, I don't know, additional travel expenses or something. Because it looks like it's all travel expenses.
Okay, item 3.3. Director Rothenberger.
Question about the logbook. Maybe I've got this wrong, but it almost seems like a duplication of effort to me if all of the expenses are going to be submitted by form anyway, or is that form that Mr. Ray showed us, is that in effect the logbook, or are we doing our records twice? And does that logbook also refer to local travel? For example?
Yeah, so you're right. The intent is that either a logbook could be used, so someone could fill out the claim form and say, you know, see attached pages from logbook, or they could detail the information for each individual trip as an individual meeting on a line in that form. And the way it's worded in the policy itself is say this requirement may be met with details of each separate trip provided on a monthly expense claim form. The sufficient detail as to location, date, and purpose are included. So the main point of it is you can do either or. It's not expected you do both, as long as it's supported with that information. And the issue that was trying to be addressed is in some cases in the past, that level of detail was lacking. You know, directors might hand in a sheet of, you know, their best estimate of the kilometers they had traveled. And I'd like it to be a little bit more detailed to properly support the expense.
Do you supply the logbooks?
No. But if you bought one, we could attach a receipt and expense it. But I think the idea, I mean, the form works fine as a standalone form. You could just detail it on each one. Like a lot of directors, you know, including yourself, I believe, would just typically in the past hand in one, you know, claim expense form per trip, and you detail this is where the trip was and how many kilometers. So it's the same idea. You could do that on the form. If it was more convenient to keep a logbook where you would be able to write down the details on a more timely basis and make sure they weren't forgotten or captured, then we wouldn't be making you replicate all of that on the form. You could, you know, photocopy it and just say as per attached, right? So it's whatever's going to work best for you.
Vice Chair Brown, I know you have to leave. Did you have anything else that you wanted to bring up?
I did. Just bear with me a moment. One of them is, why are we not doing direct deposit for expense reimbursement? And can we decrease the time between the submission of the expense and the payment for the expense?
Okay, so two questions. So the first one is that currently the accounting system we're using won't allow it. And so it's not set up to do direct deposits. The payroll system is, but not the accounts payable system. So one of the things I'm looking at is whether this accounting system is going to continue to meet our needs in the future. And I have questions.
It already doesn't.
Yeah. So there's that. The second thing about the turnaround time is really got to do with staffing, and that's an issue I'm working on as well.
Thank you. And other than that, I had a question about alternate directors and claiming expenses. It isn't about alternate directors, it's about us as individual directors who don't use an alternate and choose Zoom. When we're on Zoom, there's no need for an alternate director. Okay, hold on. What's my question here? My question is, yeah, I guess I'm wondering why an alternate isn't used in place of Zoom.
The chair to Director Brown. So going forward, you should be, if you're not able to attend, you should be sending your alternate. But if there's exceptional circumstances where both yourself and your alternate can't attend, but you physically can't be here, but you can electronically participate, then that's an option. But if you're not able to, then you should be sending your alternate.
And this is as of June that we're changing that, or?
Yeah, so it's always been in our procedure bylaw. We because of COVID, we've just sort of been allowing everyone to attend via Zoom.
Okay, that will change. Thank you. And I apologize, I do have to run.
Thank you. All right, so 3.3, we've answered the question about logbook or expense claim form. It's either or, you don't have to do belt and braces. So item 4.1, communication expenses. Any points on this one? Director Walsh?
Yeah, I'm just kind of confused on, like, as in the city, we're supplied with a cell phone and a iPad. So in TNRD, you're not supplied cell phones, but they can claim for a home internet connection or a landline? Is that the difference here? Like there's two different standards, I guess?
Yeah, the TNRD doesn't supply directors with a cell phone. We do supply, a device. So clearly you wouldn't put in a claim for that device. But, when you're communicating either with staff or with the public, you may be doing that from home. So you're using your home internet service. You may be using a personal cell phone, things of that nature. So yeah, a lot of the municipal directors don't put in much in terms of claims through communication because the municipality is already supporting them by covering some of those costs or supplying those devices. But the same isn't necessarily true of the electoral area directors. And so we've allowed up to a certain amount per year for them to get reimbursed for those expenses.
Okay, thank you.
Director Quinn?
Thank you. On those communication expenses, does the electoral area administration pay those things, or is it just the whole board pays those? That's to Mr. Ray. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm just fiddling with my mic. Sorry. Through the chair, I'm trying to remember. In general, my recollection is that those electoral area costs are charged to the electoral area administration service, so that it's just the electoral area taxpayers covering that. It's certainly true of that for the travel allowance, and I believe it's true as well for the electoral area portion of the communication expenses.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Anything else on communication expenses? On to general, 5.1. Nothing. Oh, Director Schaefer?
I don't know if it's here or where, but I would like to know if we attend a committee meeting in the morning and a committee meeting in the afternoon or a board meeting in between, do we only get paid $160 for both meetings, or do we get paid $160 for each meeting that we attend?
Ronnie got that.
Yeah, through the chair, you may recall that the remuneration bylaw only previously allowed for one meeting to be paid for per day. I believe it was the end of 2019 or early 2020 where the board amended the remuneration bylaw to allow up to 2 meetings per day. So if you're attending a committee meeting in the morning and a board meeting in the afternoon, all in one trip, you're still paid your time for both meetings. Be one set of travel expenses for one trip, but you'd be paid remuneration for 2 meetings.
I have to compare it to the city councils, but so we go to committee meetings, we don't get paid $160, but regular meetings, that's included in the regular yearly stipend, isn't it? Stipend. Did the electoral area directors get paid for the regular meetings and committee meetings?
No, I should clarify. So you're right. The regular meetings and the committee of the whole meetings are covered by the annual stipend that's paid every 2 weeks. For the individual committee meetings, they get paid on a per meeting basis, the $160. And that's because different directors may sit on different committees that meet more frequently or different numbers of committees. So it can't just be averaged out as easily as the regular board meetings that everyone attends. So you're right, they don't get a second stipend for the regular meeting, but they're not penalized for attending the committee meeting because they're attending the board meeting the same day. So they would still ultimately be remunerated through one of the 2 different methods for 2 meetings.
And further to that, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, further to that, a day like today, when there are 2 committee meetings, if you're on policy review and on invasive plants, you'd be reimbursed for both meetings.
Okay, thank you. So anything on alternate directors?
Just.
Oh,
Okay, I'll
Director
quick.
Walsh?
I just don't see, like, now
we
that
have, we have 3 minutes.
okay, with new technology, Zoom, I don't understand why we would pay possibly expenses, hotel room, everything for an alternate director to have 3 meetings in person to sit there up in the bleachers. Like, I don't think that is necessary anymore now that if we're going to keep Zooming meetings, right? Then they can just watch a Zoom meeting to get their feet wet, kind of idea, if they, in case they do eventually have an alternate replacement, right? So I just don't think that's a necessary expense anymore.
All I can think of is that Zoom meeting is no replacement for meeting in person. And of course, if they're Zooming in, then they are not meeting anyone else around the table. They are simply a face on a screen. And so part of them coming to the meeting would be possibly to meet other people around the table in person and talk to them and get a feel for the personalities around the table rather than just watching it all on a TV screen or a computer screen.
Yeah, I just think it's not a necessary expense personally.
And well, in my experience in the last 3.5 years anyway, the number of alternates who have shown up to sit in on a meeting of their own accord is
okay,
less than 5.
Thank you.
Director Rothenberger.
I disagree with Director Walsh and agree with the chair. I think this is an excellent addition. There will be a slight additional cost, of course, because they currently wouldn't be paid for such things. But the fact is that alternates are almost, a forgotten thing at TNRD meetings, because how many alternates, as you say, do you ever notice in the gallery? And this will encourage them to be involved and to keep up to speed with things that are going on and issues that might come up should they be called upon. And it's all about giving the alternates good experience so that they can perform well when it does come to having to fill in for a director. So I really like that one.
Thank you. Yeah, Director Stamer.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just for clarification, I agree, we want the alternates to be able to participate, but I was under the impression before that the director had to pay for that alternate to be there. Isn't that still the case? I mean, I understand that isn't that supposed to be still the case? You want to talk about double dipping?
Mr. Ray?
No, well, I think what you're thinking of is if the regular director does not attend a meeting and the alternate attends instead, then we claw back the annual remuneration for that one
Yes.
meeting.
Yes,
That the regular director is being paid because they didn't attend the meeting, and the
Correct.
alternate director is being paid the remuneration instead. That's the
That's still
remuneration side. What we're talking about is being able to claim basically mileage and maybe a meal on the expense side. And this is where 3 times a year, the alternate is able to claim those expenses, even when the regular director is also in the meeting. That's actually not a change. That's actually been in the remuneration bylaw. It predated my time with the TNRD. It's been the case for a long, long time.
so we're basically paying for 2 directors then.
For 3 meetings a year, with the perceived benefit being that the alternate is better prepared when they are called upon to attend a meeting and participate.
But for those 3 meetings that they are attending of their own volition to sit in the gallery and watch, they are not being paid a stipend to be here. They are here on their own time. They will get only mileage and possibly a meal. Okay. Director Gillis.
Thank you. I just want to go on record as saying on this matter, I certainly agree with Director Rothenberger. I think this is a good plan.
Thank you. It's on the record. All right, anything else on the alternates? We will quickly move on to allowable expenses, which we've already discussed. And then the other thing to discuss is Schedule B, the list of meetings, which has also been discussed. Does anyone have anything to add?
We just have a recommendation as well, I believe.
The only other thing I had on Schedule B was the grand openings for TNRD funded facilities, maximum 3 a year. I take it that would not apply to the chair, who would be expected to be at all of them. I don't know if that
Yeah.
needs to be codified in the,
I can have another look at that. There was never an intent to change what's currently the practice. So I can make sure it's described accurately.
anything else before we lose the people on screen? All right, so we are voting to, hang on, let me get to my. So the recommendation, if I can find it here, is to approve this to the board, or move this to the board. So that would be as amended heavily.
So moved.
So moved, thank you. Seconded by Director Schaefer, I think I heard. All right, so we have a motion to take this to the board as amended. Director Rothenberger.
This is one of those kind of tricky situations because I don't agree with some of the amendments, but I don't want to vote against the thing in its entirety. So I'm going to vote in favor and try again when it gets to the full board, just to put you on notice on that.
Director Walsh and Director Walsh and Director Quinn.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a few, I still think it needs amendments, so I can't vote for it without the amendment, so there's no other option.
I'm voting yes.
Director Walsh, there will be a chance to go over all this again. Hopefully not in quite as much detail with the full board. And when it comes to the full board, of course, everyone else might agree with Director Rothenberger or yourself on a point and say, we need this changed. So this is not set in stone. This is not going to be. So you can advance it to the board without, fearing that this is necessarily going to then be, this is what it's going to end up being after the whole board's had a chance to chew it over. Director Quinn, did you have a comment or?
I'm voting yes. No, just voting yes.
I think Director Quinn wants us to vote, so I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? All those
Yes.
opposed? We have Director Walsh opposed. So the motion is carried. Move to adjourn. And so moved by Director Gillis. Do I have a seconder? I'm sure we have a seconder. Stamer, all those in favor? Adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chair.